Good morning, everyone. My name is Jerry Morrison. I'm a former chair of the art department, professor of art ed, and recently retired, but returning for this event. I'd like to welcome everyone to the graduate panel discussion this morning with Dr. Nancy MacGregor. This is part of the ongoing series at Miami University, the Art Education Autobiographical Lecture Series. And this year's installment in 2005 brings to us a guest, Dr. Nancy MacGregor, as I mentioned before, formerly of Ohio State, formerly president of the National Art Education Association, formerly president of the Ohio Art Education Association, just to mention a few of her accolades and credits. The intent of the morning is to follow up on last night's lecture and give the graduate students a chance to ask Nancy a few questions and probe a few ideas that were not able to be explored in last night's lecture. So first, I would like for the graduate students to introduce themselves, and then we'll begin with questions. I've introduced myself, I've introduced Nancy. So, Ellen?
My name is Ellen Shearings, and I'm a graduate student here in art education.
Great.
I'm Gary Robertson. I'm also a graduate student in art education.
My name is Laura Eisenberg, and like them, I'm also a graduate student in art education.
And my name is Emily Kimmick, and I'm also a graduate student in art education.
Okay, great. Laura, I should also mention, is a licensed elementary teacher as well. Ellen,
Sure. I had a quick question for you. We'll just start from the beginning. I graduated from St. Francis de Sales, which is right across the way from Brookhaven. So when you were talking about your early experiences at Brookhaven, I was kind of curious. I know the Brookhaven community as it is now, and I was wondering how it was back then, and because right now it's kind of struggling. It's kind of a rundown area, and was it like that at the time that you started, or
No.
It wasn't?
No.
It was.
This is before desegregation, before busing, before drugs. We had our alcohol problems. We would receive the students from DeSales that were kicked out, expelled.
Mm-hmm.
And we also picked up some of the kids from Lynn and McKinley. And I did have some that were on parole. And the highway patrol would come through Friday afternoon and take a check. But those were essentially the students that had been moved from these other schools to put them into a different environment. And the reasons they ran into difficulty with the law was because of rumbles. And these were the rivalries between schools, particularly with the football and after football nights. And then, of course, the drinking. And that would be about it. Now, it was not an upscale, but it certainly was high, middle, blue collar. Now, Dominion Junior High, of course, was a different scenario altogether. It was a very upscale
Yeah.
school at the time, and now it no longer is either because of situations that have happened. And the busing did a great deal in Columbus Public School to destroy its structure, destroy the commitment on the part of the parents to the neighborhood school, and so on. But then, on the other hand, you have all the positive outcomes. You know, change generally motivates positive and negative consequences. And before you implement a change, it's always important to kind of map those out in your brain, have a vision, think out, where will this take us? Where will the situation, what are the positives, list them. What are the potential negatives, and list them. And then make your decision about the change. And cultural's intent in terms of change in many instances is a reaction to an event. And an event that they didn't know was going to happen. And you've seen it in your life now too. And that's where it's difficult for schools to adjust and make changes. And after the Vietnam situation, then the schools were forced in that situation of changing curriculum and eliminating courses and making them satisfactory and unsatisfactory instead of a grade, so on and so forth. It was a tough time. Some people blame all that change on, there's an argument, the debate, whether it was deseg that brought about so many changes or the Vietnam War. Now, in my mind, it was the Vietnam War. They just happened to cross at the same time in history or thereabouts. And then the one kind of exacerbated the other. And he really got into a big shift in values and attitudes and families and so on and so forth. Now, wasn't that a short answer?
I was intrigued I didn't really understand, how many years did you teach junior high? I say it because I was in
3.
junior high. 3?
And 3 in high school. The high school was interrupted and I took a year leave of absence and went to Ohio State and did the master's. And then I went back. And then Manny Barkin got the funding from the federal government for the initiation of the Seminole Project, which was the aesthetic education part 1. And again, see, the monies were just coming. And that was before DSEG and before the Vietnam thing. So you just had a lot of stuff going on, exciting stuff in terms of education. It was outside funding. And see, they worried a lot about the impact of the endowment and Nancy Hanks, the JDR fund, remember all that?
Sure.
Because they were setting standards and then art educators were writing proposals to meet those standards. It wasn't the art educators' standards. And this is why I wrote the article, Who Speaks for Art Education? Because then we wound up with that same thing again with the Getty. And the Getty kept justifying what they were doing because they'd been talking to all the art educators. Dwayne Greer, Elliott, they've been crisscrossing and so on. But they latched onto essentially one idea. And that's when they kind of got into trouble. And that idea, incidentally, which I did not include in the paper, and if I go back and kind of read, I can add, a few little things, not read it, but turn it in for the archive. Swirl was going on at the same time as Seminole, a little bit after, and there was one on the East Coast, and I forget the exact little acronym for that, but Irving Kaufman was directing that one, Manny Barkin the one in Central, and then on the West Coast, Gil Clark and Dwayne Greer were doing that. Of course, they were both Stanford graduates. And that model had the studio, the art history, and the criticism, which this is what they were doing. But somehow or other, when it came out in that swirl package, it was a studio kind of thing. Well, they were really addressing the needs of California, and they had no art teachers at the elementary. So they were doing it for the classroom teacher, and a lockstep will do this with those film strips and so on, which was a nice program, but it didn't fit the rest. And of course, it got people like Ken Marantz and a whole lot of others really agitated and worked up and hostile toward the Getty. We don't need this, we don't want this, this will set us back, and so on and so forth. But it's interesting because you had 3 going on at the same time. And then Seminole, of course, went into that phase 2. And Julie Lindsay worked with some of the Seminole packages, like creating characterization, which would be a theater kind of a thing with mass, but you could cross it over. And then there were several. I've got one in there on something about creating aesthetics, but it's kind of through photography for the arts. And again, pulling in the other arts as you go. And they created resource materials for the teachers on aesthetic education. But the implementation of those resources in so many instances, like the 5-cent store, was overwhelming. You had to have the gymnasium, you had to get all this stuff in order to put this together. So as a teaching resource material, it had limited use because pieces got lost and in other words, it did not infiltrate. But the DBAE hasn't infiltrated either. But the components that started initially, way back when, talk about art history, criticism, art and society, psychological factors, all the stuff that started in the late 50s and early 60s, I think are pretty well in place as underlying foundation for visual culture, for example. I mean, they're not throwing that out. They're just adding new content. Instead of all Western art, they're adding new content, not strategies necessarily. So all that stuff has that impact. Now, what question was that I just answered?
I think I understood how long he's been a junior high teacher. It's like Casey Stengel. I think it's an old Yankees manager who would go on and on with his answer.
Well, in terms of how long I was in high school, got interrupted there.
No, that's
Then
fine.
I went back to high school, so I was
Sure.
3 years in high school to work here. So I had my 6 years. We have to have 3, wasn't it?
Yes, we did.
Okay, so I had 6.
One thing I was curious is in our our history class of art education, we talked about how things have changed, and a lot of it is response to outside, which you had mentioned, like the Getty Foundation community. What do you see like currently as kind of the biggest need or area of improvement in art education? Is it something that's going to be responded to outside? Is it something internal that art teachers need to do, or professionals?
Well, there's no outside funding at this point in time. We have a little bit from councils. So a lot of that's the artists and residents programs and community outreach things. So there's no funding. So everybody's like on their own. So you will be looking toward universities for ideas, which is what a lot of them are working toward now with the visual culture. So you're going to see an infusion of content, which will mean resources that will be different from the norm. And some of them will be included in those new productions I've given to the department here. The great big
So
ones. There's a couple of things there that will be relevant to. Others will still be the old guard things. And of course, the debate will be how much of the old do you throw out to accommodate the new? Is there some happy compromise someplace? And the point is, every idea has a root. And I think it's important in the schools to maintain that concept that ideas do build one on another. Because your computer kind of suggests they just emerge. You poke buttons, whoop, there it is. And that's not the way the reality of the past has built knowledge. So where is it going to go? That's what I said, somewhere in this continuum of a paradigm shift. And that's what a paradigm shift is. You don't know where it's going to go. But it is going to go. So again, you look at what you have here, you think about the consequences of it. Worst case scenario, best case scenario, and kind of prepare for somewhere in between. Because there will be the worst case and there will be the best case entwined together. And of course, as young people, you have to learn to adapt, shift, and move with that. I don't have to. You don't have to. In terms of teaching
We've had our
youngsters.
shifting days.
Yeah, we did. We really did. And we worked hard with it. And it was exciting and interesting. So my point is, for younger people, it'll be just as exciting and interesting. And the backgrounds where we came from, not really that relevant to your life, other than you need to respect the past and the traditions and the roots, so that you don't make a logical blunder. And of course, never plagiarize. And the field itself, in terms of where it's going, the National Art Education Association, that's always something for you to keep your eye on, pay attention to, and if you can, be proactive with that group, because they have the power. And if they can maintain the leadership and the advocacy incentive to actually do some really important things, they have sort of around the fringes, a lot of it kind of gets lost because they don't really have the money like the Getty had or the JDR or so on. But they put out a lot of publications, but I see things that could possibly be done that might have a help, and you will too as you come along. So suggest those, talk to the people, because that's the place where you might be able to make some impact in terms of the future. So look there. Keep your eye on the kind of ideas they're advancing in studies. And it isn't what they're advancing, it's what the scholars are advancing, because the other will follow in time or maybe not. Some of it does disappear. Aesthetic education certainly disappeared in terms of impacting the schools, but it's impacted in other ways. So you have side impact of ideas. So again, if you want the history of the foundations, take a look at that book, Reading in Art Education, that's edited by Elliot Eisner and David Ecker that I mentioned. And you will see just the kind of articles that were selected. There are articles from Aesthetics with Crochet, and of course White's Nature of Art's in there, and that's a classic. I mean, this is something that everybody should have read, and it's old philosophy, old concepts, but you need to know what that theory was challenging, which was formal elements of design for good art. And then what has happened since with deconstruction and Dante and so on, you need to understand where this came from. And of course, that all started with Plato. So, this is not new. The concern is not new. You have a huge heritage of content and knowledge. So now, okay, visual culture, where did that come from? Well, it has roots. It has roots back in work that I did in the 60s. We called it Art and Society. I had a whole unit of instruction. It was a model called Has Anyone Seen Mona? And I took that through history, psychology, art, culture, how it's being used now, so on, just traced it. And it actually becomes an exemplar of the shifts of philosophical theories about the nature of art. Because it turns out kind of exemplifying. Right now it's a pop icon. It's right into visual culture. See, it's morphed itself again as a living example of a work of art. And you can study everything from science, history, by either Leonardo or the Mona, and history, philosophers of criticism, history, what the historians have said about it over the years. It's just kind of cool, where it pops up in advertisements of clothes now and so on and so forth. That was on the wall in the photograph. So it's not new, my point is. June McPhee, take a look at what she was doing in that text and then ask yourself what's happening now. What are the connections? So that would make a nice paper for you. And then where you project it's going to go next. That'd be a wonderful little MA thesis, little large MA thesis. That'd be fun for you too, and look and see ask yourself what was she looking at, what was that group looking at, and Mandy Barkin incidentally edited one of her first papers for publication, because I was there when he was doing it and he was just having a fit. He was editing, rewriting the thing so people would understand what she was saying, which I thought was really nice. He saw it as an important thrust. Now it was different from his thrust, but see, that was okay. That was all right. That's the other thing you want to do, is always make sure these ideas stay open and entertain other ideas, that visual culture doesn't clamp down and eliminate, for example, all the white male Western artists. You want to retain a couple of them, pick a couple as you go forward. To show the connections. Like Leonardo, for example. And pick good ones, don't you? And then build from that. Because when you teach, you can't teach everything. You have to be very selective. Remember I said primary and secondary resources? You have to have the skills and the wisdom to know which is which. And that's hard, especially when you don't know. Then you have to seek out somebody to help you.
What dawns on me, that question you asked is on your take-home final examination. She got a little help, didn't it?
That's all right.
I teach the history of art education now, and that was one of the questions.
Is that okay?
Yeah, that was fine. That was a nice answer.
You have a different idea for it?
No, it was.
Well, I know
fact,
you have a different idea.
actually, even the references, June McPhee's reference that I've used in class a lot with with the same era. If you were dealing with art in a social context at that time,
That's what
she was really, really very strong reference.
And then we also looked at anthropology, because that's where her stuff was rooted. In other words, we always stepped back to see where it was rooted and then came forward. And that's simply a research strategy. That's no great thing. It's just a research strategy. Always step back and then come forward and step back. But do take a look at Ecker and Eisner. And of course you have Eisner's textbooks, the other ones, but collections of readings that came out. And I think Pappas did one that had a nice collection of readings. And of course I think, didn't Zernich and Hardiman do a collection? And
They could. I do
I've
remember
got a couple
Pappas'
at
book.
home, but there's a couple that are really good.
Actually, the Eisner-Ecker book was the first book I ever bought as a professional art educator. When he was here for his lecture, I asked him to sign it.
Did you?
Yeah, it was
Well, I have Ecker's signature on it, on mine. I've never thought about Eisner. Yeah, I could have done that. I always forget this stuff, and I think, oh gee, I wish I'd have done that, but I didn't. But that's a real pillar, is that book, because it gives you a real sense. Now, not everybody picked up on that stuff. They didn't want to do it, this, that, and the other thing. There's everything in there. psychology and child development, it just goes on. Barkin's transition and art education papers in there. That was one of the pivotal pieces in art education. What don't you think?
Mhm.
Out of Penn State.
Sure was. Well, at least it's been said since.
Mm-hmm.
Reforming our field. So,
Looking back. So that'd be another one for you to refer to. And people think, wow, is he smart? He's really dumb. Except Jerry's right here.
Another question?
I was interested in when you were talking last night about how you use children's books, along with in the art lessons when you were teaching. You could just talk about that a little bit more because I have a background in early childhood.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So that's something that has always been very relevant to my undergraduate degree.
Well, children's literature, of course, is a body of itself, in and of itself. And that was to encourage youngsters to read and also to produce works of art, but not to copy from the book. In other words, do their own Seuss or whatever, but take the strand of the imagination from the book. In other words, take the concept out of the book. So I would read the book, and this was in times when they hadn't heard all this stuff. The first one I did was Cat in the Hat in the 50s with a student teaching. And I had them act out the little characters, and they went around the room and did all that stuff. Then we talked about, now where did this idea come from? Is it really this kind of stuff, the reality? Of course, they're in the imagination right away. So they just sailed off with that. So then they created their own imaginary creatures, like the Cat in the Hat, by changing colors and stripes and fabrics and so on. And then they made like puppet things out of them. So they got the idea of the book, except theirs was stationary. And of course, this was just their imagination, but it was built on the reading, but not just reading the story, but kind of deciding, I did before, what the concept was, and then help get it from them. They didn't have any trouble figuring that out, Oh yeah, and they were they're wonderful, just wonderful things that they did, just wonderful. They went light years ahead of the Cat in the Hat because they could do it because they were third grade. Mm-hmm. So I used it that way as a stimulation, but not just to make art. Now we're all going to do Cats in the Hat kind of a thing, and they all do a cat. That wasn't there wasn't a Cat in the Hat there, and they knew them. See, they didn't occur to them to copy or so on. After we went through all of this, they had to assume the feeling, and we went through that whole bit, and that was motivated in part from that trip to Michigan that Mamie Barkin took us on, because there was very little of that kind of stuff going on at the time. And then he incorporated some of that teacher talk in that second book that he wrote through creativity to art. So you have transcripts of talk. And then that's what I kind of got into, the role of the teacher, the role of teaching strategies in teaching and motivating students to think about ideas and then translate those ideas through media that's unique in their own. I really push for that, and then when that trend in high school went where you copy, I had real trouble with that. I mean, rendering your skill, although that's good, there's nothing wrong with that, rendering, learning how to use the media skillfully, but then it stopped, and they were winning first prizes and so on, and they just copied a photograph out of a photo magazine, somebody else's photograph. So I had a little trouble that the teachers weren't pushing the thinking process because it could be done so easily, and high school kids could do it. But again, that's a teaching. See, the role of teacher. It's always, I think that, like you in a classroom, you're the leader. Nothing happens if you don't do something. And that's what kind of worries me too with this computer and the virtual classroom and so on. Because you pick up on cues from the kids. I mean, you can kind of tell by looking at them, just how their little heads are working at that time. Also high school kids, although they've learned the face mask a little better. Won't let you see everything. But they're equally fun to work with because you can get that mask off in a little while. So that's how the literature. And then of course, as we worked with university students, and I had a huge collection of the books, and then all the Sendak books and the Caldecott Award books, we worked with supposedly what we tried to do were the primary resources again in children's literature. And I did do one little collection on ABC books, you know, ones that are awful and ones that are better, and old ones and new ones. And I had one of the student teachers take that out to the youngsters, and they sorted them into piles as to which ones they thought were older, and you know, they could do it just like that. You know, so there's something working that tells you that, oh, this is an old one, this is not so old, this is a new one, and this is, you know, whatever. So the point is, the teacher though is the one that's motivating that. And the elementary teacher, of course, plays such a big role in pulling together the reading and the acting and whatever. That's more than you wanted to hear too, isn't it? I'm just helping you get through so you don't have to ask too many questions.
Another question?
Well, you talked a little bit in terms of how you changed the structure to a lot of the organizations you worked with, and I was just kind of curious about like how you went about doing that, and how, I don't know, can you talk about that a little bit, or what kind of changes?
That's kind of interesting because I really don't know where all this came from. I don't know why I did all of that, and I just don't know exactly where all these ideas came from and how I was able to come up with the solutions to these problems. I gave a little bit of a clue to it in that I asked questions, and that's when Feldman was telling me things about the national. And then I thought, you know, those people who have been involved, it's been like, oh, they couldn't do, oh my, you know, that kind of thing. So then the question is, okay, now what are you going to do? And I didn't have a clue at that point. So it's day by day. And as I said in one point, you know, I always sort of saw those things as jobs. And a job is a day-to-day thing. And you have to gather in as much information as you can and talk to the people and kind of get a sense for the board where they are. If they're going to, you know, obstruct everything, that's then another set of problems. You have to work in a different way. But these boards were all really quite supportive of change initiatives. With the NAEA, like the other, collect the documents, like the Constitution, and look at that thing, and then look at what's really happening. None of the two match. Look at the guidelines that they hand, and if you're running a national thing, that means the guidelines in the states have to be fairly clear. And if they're not, or nothing is happening like that any longer because it's no longer relevant, see, there's another clue of something. And then you look at the publications if there are any. See, right now the OIEA hasn't had a journal in how long, so the OIEA is doing nothing to advance knowledge, nothing to publish ideas, nothing. And they're paid to do it. The money's there, you know, the members and so on. In other words, watch that kind of thing and see what's not happening that could be happening. Also in a school setting, just because a principal says it can't happen, they don't have the money, that maybe the principal doesn't have a vision and really doesn't look at his budget and what he has and sees that there is flexibility. There is money. There's always money. It's just whether you can access it or not, or just where it is, what it's doing. And remember, there's always a fixed budget and a indiscretionary budget. And you need to look at both. Overhead is fixed. Is it? Does it really, you know, do we really need to hire somebody to come in once a month or more than that, but pay a fee of $200 a month to have plants watered and clipped in a headquarters office that doesn't do anything but have employees in there when the association is totally bankrupt and in the red and borrowing money? It's not a whole lot of money, but it's money. So we clipped that one out. It took a little while, didn't happen right away, because boy, you know, they wanted those plants, the staff. Well, okay. Do you have plants in your classroom like that? Does somebody come in and water them, clip them for you? I don't think so. And you're paying the dues to support the organization. In other words, be sensitive to the members in terms of how money's budgeted. And then with this indiscretionary money, look at how much it is and then what they're doing with it. See, and there's where you could access that in a school and a university. Look at that and see what they're doing. There's generally travel funds in there, and there's this and there's that, and you don't know what they're doing because that's not line by line. So you want to start taking a look at that. So that'd be one way to help you begin to identify how you might start to make changes.
We're discussing that last night at your lecture. Were you able to reconcile the budget of the National Art Ed Association? Did that come through a lot of, and you mentioned last night, were there a lot of substantial cuts that you had to make, I would assume, because you didn't get that much increased income?
No, first we had to do was change executive directors. As I told you, it's up till 2 a.m. Well, he'd interviewed for it originally, and he, during the interview, and he knows it, so it's no secret, didn't come up to par. He decided, I don't know, he was state supervisor in South Carolina and doing very well and having a ball, making all kinds of changes and so on. So he was a manager and a content person, and he had his doctorate in administration, I think. And but he taught public school and so on. Of course, as our supervisor, he was in and out of all those schools. He was a people person, and of course, young like we were then, because you're looking 30 years ago, aren't we? Yes, just about 25.
It was when he started the South Carolina initiative, hiring all the
That's right.
art teachers.
And he was the one who worked that through the state. So he knew how to access people and do some stuff. Not necessarily, you wouldn't expect him to do that at the national, but to help others, as a model. So he wanted the job initially, as I say, he applied, but he didn't. So he didn't get it. So somebody else took it for a year, and then that person didn't stay and didn't work. And then Tom, since he'd interviewed before, we went through that same list of candidates. So you see, that was helpful. So I pursued Tom on that, and as I said, he'd been on the board with me, so he didn't know all the stuff. But nobody really take the time to look. I mean, you have to study. It took me a good while to unravel the budget. Flow-through money, which is conference money, which Jim Anderson was bringing in, and they were always betting on the come, so they depended on him to make the money. Well, that's a huge burden for Jim, which was with all the booths and all that, where you get the exhibitors. And he managed all that, plus negotiated with the hotels. And now we have an executive director. And what's he, what does this guy do? So a lot of questions were raised, and you begin to find that you have to, and then you have to kind of work slowly, of course. And then people were threatened, naturally. And then when Tom came in, he assumed responsibilities of both the executive director and the assistant. And he said he could do that without any problem. I could do that. And I figured if I could do it, he could do it. And it was his idea that he could do it. So in other words, he was an active player in those changes. And then we did some other office staff shifting around and other cutting, and then made a profit the next convention and began to build membership. So that was the big issue. You see, they had over 4,000 attend the convention this year. I have a large number. As I said, look at all the money we have in the foundation. And that's from the success of the National Art Education Association doing that job. So Tom's been the one who's implemented. And then he had that plan of action that I put together that he said it took him 10 years to implement. So he had plenty to do, and that was moving the thing. So he didn't worry about anything because he had this plan. Then when he was at the end of the 10 years, he said, I said, no, don't think about it. I'm not running again. But they've had other plans and so on, But it's the role of the executive director, and this is why I put that leadership seminar in for summer. As soon as the elections were over, to bring the new board members in for leadership training, and also bring the returning board members, because that's your biggest headache, is that constant churning and turning over. People that don't have a clue keep merging on your board. And so you have to bring them up to speed in terms of the vision and the mission, so that you don't then begin to create all these problems that then pulls the association down. And of course that happens because people don't know any better. What have they not done? They've not looked at the roots. They've not looked back. They just look for party time, or let's go here, or let's do that, or let's invite this speaker and spend $50,000 for him. Now wait a minute now, elementary classroom teachers make this amount of money, and as I said, I turned the whole thing around so the elementary art teacher was at the top of the pie, the top of the chart, not the board of directors and staff taking everything. Everything was to be churned back, and the secondary teacher, but the big bulk was the elementary art teacher at that time. So they needed to be cared for, was my opinion. And then the high school teacher, there's public school. Without them, there's no association. University personnel is not going to keep it going because there's not enough.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not their organization. And that was the other big problem is you have to keep your eye on with any organization. It becomes a we-they deal. Board of directors, membership, real animosity. So the board has to be open, and you have to be friendly, and you have to be one of them. You're not suddenly better. And a lot of boards feel they are. Just look at them. And a lot of board members in different state organizations refuse to leave the board. That's the other thing. So always insist on turnover. Like with the Getty, I said everybody had been there too long. They needed to get rid of them. Boy, you talk about directors not wanting to step aside. I mean, Hank, and some of them were ready for retirement and all that, 10 years is a big hunk of time. We'd already done 10 years. No reason for us to do 5 more. And that meant a lot of resistance. But of course the Getty then and the Annenberg too took care of that. So it did take place. So that's how you look for problems and how you begin to work in to make change. Now, where does this all come from? I have no idea. I have no idea what motivated me to do that. Why didn't I just rest and let it happen? And if it collapsed, well, I don't know. I just don't know. Why I have to get in there and unravel. I don't know. I don't do that at home. I'm still married to the same person. He was a change artist. I'd be wanting to change that all the time, wouldn't I? I don't know. So you have to look at yourself and see what kind of ideas entertain you and so on, and then go for it. And don't be afraid to go for it. If an opportunity comes, I always questioned it. Oh, I don't know if I'm going to do that or not. And then think about it, go home and say, well, on the positive side, this could be kind of interesting. So I was in every state. I went to taught in Vienna and different things like that on account of this stuff that wouldn't have happened otherwise, probably, just kind of fun, interesting, and the fact that we were successful. The NAEA is a success story, and that's due to a lot of people. Tom Hatfield and a lot of hardworking board members and the presidents that followed me. I mean, they really picked up on this stuff and implemented and carried the thing. I mean, they really picked up the ball. A lot of them had been on the board with me or was aware and wanted to continue it. So see, there's your other big clue. You can find people that will follow, that will run and do, and then I had the commitment and the interest and the belief in what's going on. And they were excited about it. So you had a real rallying around the flag for the national at that point. You want to keep that going. It's so important because that's what you have right now is the national. So look to for leadership. You want to run? You want to run for office? No. You're busy. Enough on your plate. Yeah.
Another question?
Good.
This is kind of off the topic of what we were talking about, but you mentioned, for my history class, I'm looking at influential women art educators in the early 1900s. And you mentioned some women that you looked to in your talk last night, Elizabeth Steiner and Laura Chapman. I was wondering if there were any other women that influenced your career, or maybe if you could share a little bit more how these women influenced your career and
Okay.
differences maybe between the women influences and some of the male influences that you experienced.
Okay. Education, higher education, when I entered it, was a male-dominated field. So there weren't many. There were some that were a lot older that were in the College of Education who had come through and started teaching in the early 30s. That movement that of course they're all gone now. So there was a big movement at that point, and then it dropped off. and there was nothing in between in terms of women entering. They were entering other fields, they were doing other things, I think, in a lot of instances, and I haven't really researched that out to know what you're looking at turn of the century and up to a certain point in education. Like Ed Feldman said, that the Western Conference for the art educators, that was the big active group before the NAEA. He'd go as a young man, and everybody just loved it because all the grand dams, the women, were dressed to the nines with their hats, and of course that was when hats were the era, and they'd come in with hat boxes with their different hats to wear that day for the conference, and they were the ones in charge.
I remember Ivan Johnson talking about the very same thing, that it was, he was one of our former speakers and also president of the NAEA, and when he was very young, he'd go to the conferences, and what a thrill it was to sit in the lobby of the hotel and watch the big city supervisors that really controlled art ed at the time.
They're not the higher ed, and of course there are like no city supervisors in the country. They're all gone. And that really changed the face of education and art education in particular, because you pulled them out. So you don't have, there's a gap there. Then, so I didn't have influence. I had no undergraduate women. I had one woman, 1/4, Coretta Mitchell, who had her doctorate from Ohio State, but really hadn't been able to whatever. And she taught one course, and I don't remember much about it. Nobody thought much about it at the time in terms of ideas or whatever. It's essentially studio, paper mache, and elementary stuff that we hadn't gotten in our art courses. We were filling in the gaps, so we were doing puppets and stuff. I don't exactly remember some of that, paper bag puppets and things, and we had kind of fun. It was all right. We thought it was a little, especially the guys from the Korean War. They were just, little sock puppet. But they were fun to watch because we were kind of entertained by that group of people. And a lot of those folks, those men were in the arts because they all took, after they got out of the Korean War, because they had this GI Bill. A lot didn't have jobs, and they could go to college or university. So they'd go, and the first thing they did was sit down and take a whole battery of tests: personality, aptitudes, jobs. You guys that didn't have high school education, that was okay, especially at a land grant school. It didn't matter because you were older. Of course, they were pretty bright at that point, seasoned. And a lot of them were steered toward art. They hadn't had art since junior high school, but they were on the GI Bill. It was just a period of their life. And some of them really took to it and have gone on. One of them has a advertising business of his own. He did very well. So, it was perfect. It was just a wonderful opportunity for those guys that survived the Korean War. And so they were there, and we were watching them, and that's my memory of Coretta Mitchell as a woman teacher, and the guys picking on what she was doing. So you see, that wasn't a real positive thing at the undergraduate level. They just weren't there. A woman at the undergraduate level that was particularly influential in terms of introduction to the university was a botany professor. And she was an old lady with white hair, and she just, took us in her arms and, helped us through, and how we were to study for these multiple choice tests, which were like, all the answers are right, but one is more right. And we thought, what is this? We didn't have a fit. And she coached us, all like mentored after. That was more like high school stuff, but she did that for us. Now that was a woman caring. None of the men professors did that. You either caught on or you didn't catch on, And so that would be a positive influence. But that was more like public school, which of course all the elementary teachers in my school, because of that progressive thrust, were very nurturing women. But the university, so it wasn't until the master's degree, and it really wasn't until that job offer to work with Elizabeth Steiner Masha in the College of Education. She was a philosopher of education, and just such a brilliant person. And I'd never worked with one like that, so I'd watch her work. And of course, she coached me on how to do all this stuff. See, it was kind of interesting because she had all this funding money. She was in this math field, so she had all this federal money. She was doing theorems and working numbers and logic. No, I'm not. And so what she hired me really didn't match. I didn't question it. She just had extra money and had extra time, and just thought she could take a graduate student. And she loved art education, all the people in it, and the arts and so on. And her husband was also a philosopher of education. And, it just was just a nice bonding. And she would just take one over there and help them. That's essentially what she did, and she had the money to do it. So that was cool. And then since I was a select one instead of with PhD people, see, that was such a unique opportunity. And I learned so much, all the gossip that anyone would want to know about anyone. I'd never had my ears so extended from my head, picking up all of this succulent material. She shouldn't have done that. That's kind of like the Zernich and Hardiman would tell her everything. He kind of had the inside scoop. And that was it was fun on many counts. So she was a friend, a good friend, and included me as kind of like one of the gang, which was nice rather than the kid. So that was my first big experience, my major experience. And of course, Laura Chapman. See, there were no women in the department when I started. No women graduate students. And so Laura was an anomaly. And she'd already finished, essentially was finishing up her degree, and then she came back. There was a year in there, I think, where she went to Illinois. And then she came back to Ohio State to work, teach, and of course she was a good teacher. And prepared all kinds of resource material, so that was a good clue, which that's what we did when we taught public school anyway. So it wasn't that unusual for me to kind of pick up on that. And of course, the way she thinks and how she processes and then presents her ideas. And I've done a lot of that. And her ideas, incidentally, come from Elizabeth's information. That's where she studied with her, too. See, Elizabeth would take, but it turned out, looking back, the women. And she nurtured Laura and helped her on structuring her games for her dissertation. And then, of course, worked with me and helped me with this abstracting and the research thing and the body of knowledge. I had all that done. I didn't realize at the time, what a magnificent experience this was, because that just fed the doctor. I mean, I was ready to go. And again, the only woman in the doctorate program that stayed, finished and did all that sort of thing. And the only married one. See, all that changed after. And then, then it doesn't, those aren't issues any longer, but they sure were then. Nor did they hire their own OSU graduates, let alone one with 3 degrees. See, that was a university rule. It just wasn't done. You just didn't do it. Nor did they hire married couples. So the Stein, Elizabeth and her husband George, they broke the rules for that. See, I've always seen things, there's this rule, but, so I've never been particularly like my great aunts, the one at the turn of the century. Well, they, of course, we do what we want to do. We have to facilitate it and take advantage of opportunities, but we don't sit there and say, oh no, we're not allowed to do that because we're women. So I never felt that. I never did. And that's, most women have felt that pretty heavily as they've come through and they've felt, some of the discrimination and so on. And I've not felt that either. I did get caught in it in terms of pay at the university. Of course, you didn't at public school, so it wasn't an issue because it was the same. I never thought about it. Then I hit the university and I got whacked pretty good because I was a female. But I didn't pay a whole lot of attention. See, I wasn't really sensitized to that, and then I registered a little later. I'm like, wait a minute, what is this? And then I was told, well, you're a woman and you are married and you don't have a non-working wife and children. I thought, what's this? What's this got to do That was the first time. And I won't tell you who told me that. It wasn't Manny Barkin. But I won't tell you. And that was a rude awakening. And I thought, well, I resent this. And then I was stuck because I had the salary. See, once you're stuck in line with an incoming salary, every time there's an increment, they never raise this base up to where you should be, then give you your increment. Now there were some equity cost increases for the women on campus several times, because this wasn't unique to the department. I didn't know universities were discriminatory like that. Just hadn't paid attention. Again, just hadn't paid attention. And then, wow, what's this? Because of the public school, I thought, oh, this isn't right. Well, it's still the case, but not quite it's not like it was. I mean,
Seemingly not.
you talk a big gap with the guys that were in there the same length of time as I was, and different backgrounds and so and doing different workloads, and something was wrong somewhere. But then I just kind of, what are you going to do at that point? Just set it aside and go on and do what you want to do. Do your job. But that would be the only time I got caught. Of course, that was financially big time, which of course impacts what I'm getting now too in my retirement. So that's my only real feminist issue that I experienced. And the two females in my education. And in my career afterward, as a professional, women influences? None. I've been the one. Because I moved from that, as I said, I've been a student all my life. I kind of moved from that, who's influencing. Then it became colleagues. And then we worked together as colleagues. So you see, that was a different kind of a relationship, But influences, I can't say there were any. Now there have been colleagues like Laura who has been, consistent and concerned and unaware and supporting and appreciative of what, some of the things that, so she's stayed in tune. So that would be another valuable aspect of a woman model, to stay in tune as you go through your career. And there are a lot of them out there now. A lot of them. You have some right here.
And one that I first started with here was Sandra Packard.
Yeah.
And she was first president of the Women's Caucus. And she made people very much aware of some of the things you're talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and
She
she
moved
went
on
on.
to other
Yeah,
places.
and she went on through the president of the university's program for administrative training and stuff like that. Now, Ohio State wouldn't admit women into that at that point. Now, it's a different attitude of a president. So you have to kind of be in the right place at the right time, like I said. If I hadn't have been on the doorstep of Ohio State 99, 100% of my life, I wouldn't have experienced that. Think if I'd been, wherever, then what would have, but that was always what ifs. Now, the what ifs in my case aren't better than what I actually went through. So you see, my life has been really, really wonderful, both professionally and personally. Very, very blessed. So I'm just doing fine.
Why don't we ask one more question and we'll wrap it up. Anyone else have another question?
This kind of goes along with it, but last night you were talking about how it seemed almost like you kind of got drugged along in the beginning. Like it's like, come on. It seemed that there were definite mentoring influences, people who stepped into your life and saw potential or saw interest, and it's like, okay, I'm going to bring you along. Would you say that that's accurate, that mentoring has been a very important part of your life?
Absolutely. They've opened the doors, like Manny Barkin, I might not have taught, like I said. I might have gone off into what I thought I really wanted to do. And, but see, there was always somebody behind there doing something. And I remember at one point Dave Ecker said, graduate students don't have a clue what their professors do in their lives after, and the role they play behind, by telling, talking, so on. Like as Charles Goodwin probably was the one that I really have to thank, and he was my student teacher supervisor because he picked up on the stuff I was doing, student teaching, and apparently, of course, went to Barkin and said whatever he said because we had graduates that were out there looking for jobs that I thought were stellar. And they were bright, competent, did a good job student teaching. But Manny is, you know, he picked up the phone and kept going. I stressed several times, I haven't graduated. Help, you know, I haven't done any of the paper. I never applied for a job. I've never prepared the application materials. I still haven't done it. I did for going through the tracks at the university, you know, to be full professor and all that stuff, you know, the VITA. But I've not really done the interview process, you know, where you go, that's why I said, I hadn't done this stuff. He said, we don't. Seen a lot of doors like that have been opened, people who've taught here, like you've opened doors for people and so on. Now, why is one person selected instead of another? You know, you're in the right place at the right time so you've got all kinds of opportunities here that you're pursuing, and there are people that are helping you pursue these by pointing, like you've not done this before. Oh, well, see, you've learned thus, and thus. You're a little richer now because of it. You say, oh, it was a lot of work, but it was worth it. You know, it paid off. So then you can begin to look around. Well, now what else might there be out there? But you're in the right place. Now, if you were at another university or whatever, you wouldn't have that opportunity, which opened that door, which then might lead you to another spot. So part of it is timing, part of it is being in the right place. And then as I pointed out in the paper, a lot of this interest, see, I had interest in me from my parents. And I just sort of thought people were supposed to be interested in you. And of course, that just kind of continued. You know, like Manny Barkin, drop in and see me. In the middle of the afternoon, I look, there he is, you know, with his camera or something. He just wants to see what's going on. Now, see, that's just bizarre. Especially with you hear the stories about Manny Barkin. See, my relation and my take on him is so different than anybody else that graduated from Ohio State. It's just different. Now, why? Who knows? Probably because of Charlie Goodwin and student teaching. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe from the bus trip to Michigan. You know, you just don't know why that happened. So you need to be sensitive to opportunities, of course, and just take advantage. And then I suppose if you do have a chance for different job locations, see, I never moved. Now, that doesn't mean I couldn't have. Mac might have. You know, that was the other issue, of course. And of course, that's your male-female problem, being married, it's mobility. And you notice a lot of your faculty here. One's here and one's there. One's there and one's here. And there's this commuting stuff. And when Elizabeth Mayshell left Ohio State and went to Louisiana, George, who'd been a pilot in the Second World War, got a little Blanca, and he'd fly on weekends. And Max and Chris, we were friends because she took you in, and Mac and all of them, they really liked one another. And Max said to me just one sentence, and I didn't pick up on it, and I didn't pursue it. He said, "Now I just want to say something here. Don't get it in your head that I'm going to buy a Blanca and fly on weekends halfway across the country. So, you know, to where you may be working." Well, we weren't at that point. Wasn't an issue, so why pick it up and start wrangling about it and making it a big thing? I just let it go, but remembered it. And I could appreciate that. This was hard. He'd go out in bad weather, you know, his little plane, and, you know, and then it just was really tough on him. Then they both got jobs at Indiana and Bloomington. But that was tough. And that, of course, was a feminist issue as such, you know, and it's a cultural issue and so on. So you always have that to kind of think about. I didn't deal with it, just in the right place. So fortune, I guess. So I'm not exactly the norm, which makes it kind of a more interesting story because you can use it as a mirror against the norm. Now, who would be the norm from my era that came up when I did and was receiving their degrees from other places? Jean Rush, married women. That you could take a look at to see if just how much difference there might be. Who else? I can't think right now either.
Nancy's just a little older than I am. So
Oh,
I'm trying-
yes. Get
I
back.
think about 4 years. I was counting last night, and I was trying to think of contemporaries who would be similar and can.
Now, when you went to graduate school, did you have
At Penn
women
State?
in the doctorate program, married women?
Yes. Yes.
Who?
Did
they graduate?
Yes. I'm trying to think. Nancy, it's been a few years.
I know.
I'm trying to. Yes, we did. But there were more men, obviously. But we did have some married women in the Penn State PhD program. But it was as you say, it was a transitional period.
It was
of time.
transitional.
Yeah, it
You were a
really
little
was.
behind me where they were beginning to do that. See, I was already out by the time probably.
Well, and you mentioned the Vietnam War
Mhm.
and opening attitudes and things like
I
that.
did a lot.
And this was just, it was, my last year was when the POWs came home, so it was right at that.
So you were after. See, I was just finishing up when the riots at Ohio State. We watched them throw the tear gas back and forth with the reserves, and the kids.
Yeah.
Oh God, here it comes. Back over the other way. It's just a big frolic for them. Fortunately, no one got shot. They got a little rowdy, but it didn't turn into a Kent State thing. Of course, they could have because they were out by the thousands. And it was a riot because they tried to they did. They took the administration building, the whole scenario. And so that was, I really think that did it. I think the country had just gone through so much with that war and
I agree.
began to question. Of course, it was on the heels of that Korean War, which was another standoff. See, we left that situation without a clear. And of course, that was on the heels of World War II, when they wanted to take care of the stuff and put some of these issues to rest, and were there and had the military and the leaders and so on, and NATO, and all of that. They didn't do it. They just let everything go and began to mushroom up again. And so this, I think, in terms of values and belief and governments and so on, we begin to raise some of those questions. The culture, because they came out of World War II with a very clear, supportive attitude toward the soldiers. Remember the kinds of stories soldiers told and the kinds of health problems they had after World War II? You didn't hear any of that. There were none. Sure, there were all kinds of psychological problems and crises, but that was a given. That wasn't, they didn't become a huge, big disease like this syndrome or that syndrome or so on. Just a different, it was a victor's attitude, etc. Very different. And of course, we have different things going on now too. Times change.
Which sort of brings us up
To
to
the
today.
end. To the end.
And it is a time for
Don't
us to
you
quit.
love the tie? See? This is a
I
little
wore my
Mexico
tie for the day. Yes, it's mine. I love my school bus tie.
Isn't that nice?
Nancy, thanks again.
Mhm.
It's been a pleasure having you here, and it's been a pleasure knowing you over the years.
Yes, it has,
And
hasn't it?
working together when we worked with the OAEA, that's when I first got to know you, and have followed you all these years. And thank you for your service to the organization. And certainly appropriate that you be one of our participants in this
Well, thank
lecture series.
Thank you. It's an honor. It really is.
And graduate students, thank you. Let me tell you a little phenomenon that will happen. Let's say that somewhere out there, one of you becomes a professor and you come back to Miami. And someone that's a graduate student someday gets the tape out from this. And they will howl and laugh and laugh and howl at how you look then. And that happens to me from time to time, because we've done this over several years since I came here in 1973. Thank you again.
Yeah,
And
and you started in 72 or 73?
72 before I came. Yes, the first speaker was Edwin Ziegfeld,
Mm-hmm.
and they had Mary Adeline McKibben, and then I was here for the third one, and it was Victor D'Amico.
Mm-hmm.
And
And Ziegfeld graduated from Ohio State.
who was from Columbus.
Mm-hmm. And totally supportive of all the stuff with the NAEA. He was just so nice, just such a gentleman.
Evidently, he really was. He was Harold Truax's thesis advisor,
Was
so he
he?
had a connection with
Oh,
Miami.
yeah.
And actually, the first person that was supposed to start the series was Victor Longfelt, and he died
Yeah.
before he came.
Right at that
So
point.
on that uplifting note,
Yeah, that's history.
thank you again. Thank you again. And thanks again, graduate students.
Yeah,
Really
thanks
appreciate you
for
spending some
coming.
time.
And thank you again. And you, Emily, for both of you, Ellen and Emily. They're the ones that were toting books and
Oh, I
research.
saw them this morning. Now, Ellen, you're taking Nancy, you're helping her along.
Yeah.